She stood up at my grandmother's memorial, raised her glass, and called her a lonely old woman who had been taken advantage of. She did not say my name. She did not have to. Every single person in that fellowship hall knew exactly who she was describing. I sat at the table with my hands in my lap and I let her finish. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out a cream envelope and said she left a letter. She asked me to read it here. Would you like me to do that now? My mother put her glass down. The room went completely still. Welcome back to the empty chair, where the women who were written out of the story finally get to tell it themselves. If you have ever watched someone rewrite your love into something suspicious, this one is for you. Subscribe before you keep reading, because what was in that envelope is something my grandmother wrote herself, and it took her 84 years to say it, and she deserved to have it heard. But I need to start 6 years before that fellowship hall. Because the letter only makes sense if you understand the Sundays. My name is Claire Hendricks. I'm 36 years old and I practice real estate law in Charleston, South Carolina. I read contracts for a living. Wills, deeds, trusts. The documents people sign at the most important moments of their lives without always understanding what they are agreeing to. I know what a carefully prepared document looks like. I know what one looks like when it has been rushed, or pressured, or signed by someone who did not fully understand the terms. I know the difference in the language and in the structure and in the specific choices a person makes when they are trying to say something true before they no longer can. My grandmother Evelyn's will was the most carefully prepared document I have ever read. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. She left everything to me. The house on Palmetto Street, where she had lived for 41 years. The savings account with $340,000 in it, built over 6 decades of careful living by a woman who had grown up with very little and never forgot what very little felt like. And the blue ceramic cup from the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet, itemized by location in the document itself, because Evelyn was precise about everything and she wanted me to have the cup, and she wanted there to be no question about it. My mother found out 4 days after the funeral. She called at 7 in the morning, which she never does, and before she said a single word I understood from the hour alone that something had shifted in the way she understood the situation. She said, "The lawyer called your uncle." She said, "Claire, what did you do to that woman?" What I did was show up every Sunday for 6 years. But I am getting ahead of myself. Evelyn Marsh was my mother's mother, which becomes more surprising the longer you knew both of them. My mother Diane organizes the world around what it owes her and keeps careful track of the balance. Evelyn organized the world around what she could give it and never kept track of anything except her recipes and her Sunday crossword completion rate, which she maintained at roughly 94% until she was 81. They came from the same house and the same childhood and produced entirely different understandings of what it means to be a person in a family. I was always closer to Evelyn than anyone else. And I want to be precise about why, because precision matters in a story like this one. It was not that she favored me in the way families sometimes play favorites. It was that I was the one who showed up. Not because I was assigned to it, or because I drew the short straw, or because I was trying to position myself. Because from the time I was in my mid-20s, Sunday afternoons at Evelyn's kitchen table were the best part of my week. She made tea in the blue cup, always the same way every time, and we talked about things that actually mattered. Not the surface things that circulate at family gatherings, the job updates and the house renovations and the mild complaints about traffic. The real things, what I was afraid of, what she had learned that she wished she had known earlier. The mistakes she had made in her marriage and what they had cost her and what they had taught her. The things she was proud of that no one had ever thought to ask about. We talked the way people talk when they have decided that the time they have together is too short to spend on things that do not matter. My grandfather died 7 years ago. Evelyn stayed in the house on Palmetto Street. My mother suggested she sell it and move somewhere more manageable. My uncle Rick, her only son, suggested an assisted living facility, which Evelyn declined with the directness she brought to things she had already decided. She stayed. I started coming every Sunday instead of every other Sunday. Not because anyone asked, because I knew she was alone in that house and I could not think of a reason not to go. My mother came for holidays. Uncle Rick and his wife Pat came for Thanksgiving and occasionally Easter. My cousin sent cards at Christmas and called on birthdays. Evelyn never complained about any of it, that was not her way. What she did was notice. She noticed who came and she noticed who did not, and she held both kinds of information with the same quiet. 6 years of Sundays, 40 minutes each way. 6 years of the blue cup and the crossword and the conversation and the particular light in that kitchen in the late afternoon. I have never calculated the total driving time because it never felt like a thing that required calculating. It was Sunday. I went to see my grandmother. In the last 2 years of her life, Evelyn's health declined the way it declines at 82, and then 83, and then 84. She did not lose her mind, which she had always said was the thing she feared most. She lost mobility and then some independence and then the ability to drive, which she grieved more than anything else because the car had been her freedom for 60 years. I drove her to her medical appointments. I learned which pharmacist she preferred and which doctor she trusted and which neighbor could be called in an emergency. I was not her caretaker in any formal sense. She had a home health aide named Gloria 3 mornings a week, but I was the person who was there. She told me about the will 8 months before she died. We were at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in February, the light coming through the window low and pale the way it comes in February in Charleston. She said, "I have updated my papers. I want you to know what I decided and why I decided it. So you're not surprised and so you understand it was a decision I made carefully and freely and with a completely clear head." I want to tell you honestly what I felt when she said that. It was not satisfaction. It was not relief. It was closer to grief, because the only context in which a conversation about a will makes sense is the context of a person who is preparing to be gone, and I did not want to think about her being gone. I told her she did not need to explain herself to me. She said, "I know I do not need to. I want to. There is a difference." She told me what she had decided. The house, the savings, the cup on the second shelf. She talked for about 20 minutes, which was a long time for Evelyn, who had always been careful with words. When she finished, she poured more tea into the blue cup and pushed it across the table toward me and said, "I also wrote a letter. It will be with the will. You will know when to read it." I said, "How will I know?" She smiled. She said, "You will know the way you have always known things. By paying attention." She died on a Thursday morning in April. Quietly, in her own bed, which was what she had wanted. Gloria called me at 7:15. I drove to Palmetto Street and I sat with her for a while before I called anyone else, because I needed a few minutes that were just mine and hers before the logistics of other people's grief arrived. The house was very still. The blue cup was on the second shelf where it always was. I made tea in it and I sat at the kitchen table and I talked to her a little, which I know is a strange thing to say, and which I would do again without hesitation. Uncle Rick arrived 3 hours after the funeral home. He came with Aunt Pat and they moved through the house with the particular energy of people assessing a situation, opening cabinets briefly, standing in doorways, asking questions about what Evelyn had kept where. My mother arrived the following day from Columbia. She cried when she came in, genuinely, and I held her, genuinely, because whatever else is true about my mother, she had just lost hers. For 2 days we moved through the arrangements with the ordinary difficulty of people who are sad and practical at the same time. The will was read by Evelyn's attorney, David Carver, who had been her lawyer for 20 years. He called me the Monday after the funeral. He said he would like the family to come in at the end of the week. I knew from his voice that he was prepared for the room to change when he read what the document said. My mother, Uncle Rick, Aunt Pat, and I sat across from David on a Friday afternoon. He read the will clearly and without preamble. The house on Palmetto Street to Claire Hendricks. The savings account in its entirety to Claire Hendricks. The blue ceramic cup from the kitchen cabinet, second shelf to Claire Hendricks. A small bequest to Gloria. A note to the rest of the family acknowledging them by name and wishing them well. The room changed in stages, Uncle Rick's face first, a slow recalibration. Then Aunt Pat, who looked at her husband, then my mother, who looked at me with a long, complicated expression I could not fully read. David folded the document and said, "There is also a letter, addressed to the family, which Ms. Marsh asked to be distributed at the memorial service." He handed me a cream envelope with Evelyn's handwriting on the front, "For my family, to be read by Claire." My mother said, "I think there has been some mistake." David said gently, And without any ambiguity at all, there is no mistake. Ms. Marsh was of sound mind and prepared this document with full understanding of its contents. Uncle Rick said she was an old woman. She was alone. People take advantage. I looked at my uncle. I looked at my mother. I thought about 6 years of Sundays. I thought about the envelope in my bag. I thought about what Evelyn had said about knowing when. I put the envelope in my bag. I thanked David. I drove to Palmetto Street and I sat at the kitchen table, and I did not open it because I knew it was not yet time. I want to tell you about the particular loneliness of being the one who shows up in a family where showing up is not the norm, because I think it goes unnamed most of the time and the silence around it does damage. It is not the loneliness of having no one. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who are technically present and functionally absent, of being in a room full of relatives at Thanksgiving, and understanding that the most honest conversation you have had all year was at a kitchen table 40 minutes away on a Sunday afternoon with a woman who was 83 and declining and still more fully herself than anyone else in the room. That is a specific kind of alone, and it has its own weight, and I carried it for 6 years without a name for it. Evelyn knew. She had been that person herself, in different configurations, for most of her life. The daughter who stayed in the town when the others left. The wife who kept the household running while the career required absence that nobody analyzed too carefully. She had been lonely in the same specific way. And one of the things that made our Sunday conversations what they were is that we recognized it in each other without either of us having to say so directly. She said once on a November afternoon when we had been talking for almost 3 hours that the hardest thing about getting older was not the body. The body she could manage. It was inconvenient and sometimes humiliating, and she was matter-of-fact about both. The hardest thing, she said, was watching the people you loved become strangers, not through any dramatic falling out, but simply through the slow accumulation of distance. Priorities, geography, busy lives, until one day you looked across a family dinner table and realized you knew the surfaces of everyone there and the depths of almost no one. Then she looked out the window and said, "Except you." She said it without flourish, the way she said the things that mattered most. "I have always known the depths of you." I said something inadequate in response, but I remembered it. I have remembered it every Sunday since. The first few years of Sunday visits were simple. I went because I wanted to. I stayed 2 or 3 hours. I drove home feeling better than when I arrived, which is the clearest sign that a relationship is functioning the way it is supposed to. The years after my grandfather died were different. Not worse, not in every way, but weighted differently. The visits became something I understood were more necessary than before. Not to me, though they were still necessary to me. To her. And holding both of those truths simultaneously, that I was there because I wanted to be and also because she needed me to be, without resolving them into something simpler, is one of the harder things I was asked to do in those years. What I did not experience, and I want to be clear about this, was the sense of waiting for something. I am a lawyer. I have seen what it looks like when someone positions themselves near an elderly relative with an awareness of what is coming. I know the visiting that is actually a form of patience, the kindness that is a form of calculation. It looks a particular way, and it feels a particular way to the person on the receiving end. And Evelyn, who had spent 84 years reading people with uncommon accuracy, would have recognized it immediately. She did not recognize it in me because it was not there. What was there was the blue cup and the crossword and the conversation about real things. What was there was 40 minutes each way every Sunday without exception, in rain and in summer heat, and on the Sundays when I was tired from the week and the easier thing would have been to stay home. I made the drive because the alternative was not going, and not going was something I could not make myself do. In the last year of her life, Evelyn was admitted to the hospital twice. The first time was in the fall, a respiratory infection that lasted 4 days. I was there for most of them, sleeping in the chair the nurses repositioned for me without being asked. I brought the crossword books from her nightstand at home, because she could not sleep without working through at least one puzzle before she turned off the light. I brought the cardigan from the hook by the back door, because hospital rooms are always cold, and she had strong opinions about being cold. On the second night, around 2 in the morning, she woke and found me in the chair and said, "You should go home and sleep." I said, "I slept some." She said, "In that chair, I said, "The chair is fine." She looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're going to be very tired when this is over." I said, "I know." She said, "That is all right. Being tired after something matters is different from being tired for no reason." I have thought about that sentence many times since. Being tired after something matters is different from being tired for no reason. The most precise description I have ever heard of the difference between the exhaustion that depletes you and the exhaustion that is simply the physical record of having been present for something important. My mother called the hospital on the third morning to check on Evelyn's condition. The nurse told her a family member had been present since the admission. My mother asked which one. The nurse said her granddaughter. My mother called me immediately after. Her voice had a quality I recognized as the specific mixture of relief and something else. Something she would not have named as guilt, but which functioned exactly like it. She said she was glad someone was there. I said yes. She said she was going to try to come down that weekend. She came on Saturday, the fourth day, the day Evelyn was discharged. She sat with her for 2 hours and held her hand, and I made tea for both of them and gave them the afternoon. My mother left before dinner. She hugged Evelyn for a long time at the door. She hugged me too and said, "Thank you for being here." I said, "Of course." Then she drove back to Columbia and I stayed, as I had been staying, and Evelyn and I watched the evening news together, and she fell asleep in her chair before the weather, and I covered her with the blanket from the sofa and let myself out quietly. That was the last Sunday before she died, though it was a Thursday. I have decided it counts. The second admission was in April, 3 weeks before the end. This one did not end in discharge so much as in the understanding, spoken between Evelyn and her doctor in clear and practical language, that what came next would happen at home. I was in the room for that conversation. I held her hand while the doctor spoke, and Evelyn asked precise questions about the timeline and the process with the composure of someone who has made her peace with a thing and simply wants the operational details. Afterward, when the doctor left, she looked at me and said, "Well?" I said, "Well?" She said, "The crossword is not going to finish itself." I almost laughed. I did laugh. A little, the kind that arrives before you can stop it. She patted my hand. We drove home to Palmetto Street that afternoon with the hospice arrangements in place, and I helped her get settled in her chair and made tea, and we sat in the kitchen in the late light and talked for 2 more hours about everything, except what we both knew was coming, which is its own kind of saying it. If you have ever been accused of loving someone too well, stay with me? Subscribe if you have not already, because the memorial service is coming and what happens in that fellowship hall is something I have replayed in my mind every single day since. The memorial was held the following Saturday at Evelyn's church. Not a funeral, she had been clear about that. She had already been buried privately with just immediate family. A memorial. A gathering of the people who had known her and wanted to mark that knowing. About 70 people came. Her church friends. Her neighbors. Gloria in the third row, crying quietly from the beginning. David Carver in the back. My family in the front rows with the self-conscious positioning of people who are aware they are being observed. The service was right. The pastor spoke. 2 of Evelyn's friends from her Bible study shared memories that made the room laugh and then cry in close succession, which is the best kind of remembering. The hymn she had requested was played, which I had coordinated with the music director because I was the one who knew which hymn it was. Afterward, in the fellowship hall, people gathered around tables with iced tea, and the particular careful warmth of a community that has lost someone it genuinely liked. I moved through the room speaking to people who had known Evelyn in the chapters of her life I had not been present for, the decades before I existed. The years of the church choir and the neighborhood association and the friendships that had lasted 50 years. Every conversation added something to the picture of her I already had, which is one of the things memorials do when they are done right. My mother stood to speak. She does not miss an opportunity to speak. She held her glass and talked about Evelyn with the warm authority of a daughter who had loved her mother. And most of what she said was true, and I let myself hear it. Evelyn had been generous. Evelyn had been warm. Evelyn had sacrificed for her family. All of this was true. Then my mother said, Evelyn was a woman who was sometimes vulnerable to the attentions of people who knew how to make themselves indispensable. The room shifted. Not dramatically. The way a room shifts when something has been said that everyone heard and no one is immediately sure how to process. My cousin at the table across from me looked at her hands. Aunt Pat studied her napkin. Two of Evelyn's church friends exchanged a glance over their iced tea. My mother did not say my name. She did not need to. Everyone in that fellowship hall understood exactly whose attentions she was describing. I had been sitting with this woman every Sunday for 6 years, and every person in that room knew it because Evelyn had told them, with the particular pride of someone sharing something they are genuinely glad about. I reached into my bag. My hand found the envelope without my having to look, front pocket, zipper closed, exactly where I had put it because I had known, the way Evelyn said I would know, that this was the moment. I held it under the table for a breath. I thought about what she had said in February. You will know the way you have always known things, by paying attention. I stood up. My mother stopped mid-sentence. The room turned toward me with the collective attention of people who understand that something is happening and are waiting to see what it is. I said, Evelyn left a letter. She asked me to read it at the memorial. I think this is the right moment. I opened the envelope. The paper was cream, the same as the envelope, and the handwriting was Evelyn's, careful and slightly uneven the way it had become in the last year. But entirely legible, entirely her. I cleared my throat. I read. The letter said, to my family? I'm writing this in January, on a Sunday afternoon after Claire has gone home and the house is quiet, and I have been thinking about what I want to say to all of you. I have never found it easy to say difficult things out loud. Writing has always been easier, which is why this letter exists. I want to tell you why I made the choices I made in my will, because I believe you deserve to understand them in my own words and not through anyone else's interpretation. I am of sound mind. I have been of sound mind for the entirety of the time I have been considering this. I want that on the record. Claire visited me every Sunday for 6 years. Not because I asked her to. Not because anyone arranged it or assigned it or expected it. Because she wanted to. She sat at my kitchen table and she talked with me about real things, and she drove me to my appointments when I could no longer drive myself, and she learned which pharmacist I preferred and which doctor I trusted, and she knew about the blue cup and what it meant to me, and she never once made me feel like any of it was a burden she was tolerating. It was the most consistent kindness anyone has shown me in my adult life, and I want to be clear that I'm not confused about what it was. It was love, plain and without agenda. I know what some of you will say. I know the word that will be used. I want to address it directly. Claire did not take advantage of me, she showed up. There is a difference between those two things, and I have had 84 years to understand it. The people who take advantage arrive when there is something to take. The people who love you arrive when there is nothing to take except an afternoon and a cup of tea. Claire arrived every Sunday for 6 years, with nothing to gain, and she gained my whole heart and my complete trust, and this is what I have chosen to do with that. I love all of you. I want you to know that is true, and I mean it without reservation. But love is not the same as showing up, and for 6 years the person who showed up was Claire. The house and what is in it should go to the person who knew what was in it. The blue cup goes to the person who drank from it. Please do not spend your grief making this smaller than it is. I lived a long life, and I made my own choices, and this is the last one I will make in writing. Honor it, or do not, but know that I made it with a clear head and a full heart, and I would make it again. I love you, Evelyn. The fellowship hall was completely silent when I finished. The kind of silence that has weight and texture that you can feel against your skin. I folded the letter carefully. I put it back in the envelope. I sat down. My mother did not speak. Uncle Rick was looking at the table. Aunt Pat had her hand over her mouth. Gloria, in the third row, was crying in a different way than she had been crying before. And I understood the difference. 2 of Evelyn's church friends were nodding slowly, the nod of women who had known her for decades and were hearing her voice in those words and finding it exactly right. My cousin Jessica, Uncle Rick's youngest, reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Nobody in that room said a word about vulnerability or indispensability or lonely old women for the rest of the afternoon. I want to tell you what the room looked like after I finished reading. Not the broad strokes, the silence and the nodding. I have already told you those. I mean the specific details that I noticed because I was looking clearly, the way you look when the thing you have been preparing for has just happened and your body does not yet know how to shift from readiness into whatever comes next. Uncle Rick had his hands flat on the table in front of him. Both hands palm down, the posture of a man who is keeping himself in his chair through a deliberate act of will. He was not looking at me. He was looking at a point somewhere between the centerpiece and the tablecloth, and I recognize the expression because I have seen it in conference rooms when a contract clause reveals something a client was not expecting. The expression of a person recalibrating. Aunt Pat was crying, which surprised me. Not loudly, not performing it, but the real kind, the tears that arrive before a person has decided to let them. She and Evelyn had not been close in any way I had witnessed. But something in the letter had reached her, and I do not know exactly which sentence it was, and I have decided not to try to identify it. Some things about other people's grief belong to them. My cousin Jessica's hand was still over mine. She had not moved it. She was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as recognition, the look of someone hearing something named that they have known without words for a long time. She texted me that evening, after everything had wound down and the fellowship hall had emptied and the church ladies had packed up the iced tea and the finger sandwiches. She said, "For what it's worth, I thought the letter was perfect." I texted back. She wrote it, not me. Jessica said, "I know. That's why it was perfect." My mother sat down sometime during the reading. I do not know exactly when because I was looking at the page, but when I looked up at the end, she was seated and her glass was on the table and her hands were in her lap and her face was doing something I have not seen from it before or since. Not anger, not the performance of grief. Something quieter and harder to look at. The face of a person who has just heard something true said out loud in a room full of people and understood that the truth was partly about them and that there is no response to that which does not make it worse. She did not say anything for the rest of the memorial. She hugged two of Evelyn's church friends before she left. She hugged me at the door briefly and said she would call me during the week. She did not call me during the week. She called me 3 weeks later, which is when we had the conversation I am about to tell you about. David Carver found me near the coat rack as the last guests were leaving. He said quietly, "She updated this will 4 times in the last 3 years." Each version was consistent with the previous ones in every meaningful respect. "I want you to have the full picture." I thanked him. He nodded. He said, "She also told me at the last update that she was confident her family would understand her choices once they had time to sit with them." He paused. He said, "She was an optimist." I said she was. He said it served her well for 84 years. Then he put on his coat and left, and I stood in the empty fellowship hall for a few minutes in the quiet that follows a room full of people. And I thought about Evelyn at her kitchen table in January, writing the letter while the house was quiet after I had gone home. And I thought about the second cup set out on mornings I was not there. And I held both of those things, and I drove home. Stay with me, because the conversation that happened between me and my mother 3 weeks later is the one I have never told anyone in full. And it changed the way I understand what happened in that house on Palmetto Street for the last 6 years of Evelyn's life. The legal challenge my uncle threatened and then abandoned happened quickly. He called me the following Wednesday, a week after the memorial, and said he had spoken to his own attorney. The attorney had told him what I could have told him myself and what David Carver had already made clear. A will prepared by a person of sound mind with full legal counsel and no evidence of undue influence is not something that can be successfully contested on the basis of a family's disagreement with its contents. He said it without anger, which surprised me. He sounded tired. I told him I understood and that I was sorry for his loss. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "She always did like you best." I said, "She always did know us best." He said nothing for a moment and then said goodbye. It was not a warm goodbye. But it was not a final one, and I took it as what it was. My mother and I had our real conversation 3 weeks after the memorial. Not on the phone, but in person, at a restaurant she suggested in Columbia, neutral ground. She arrived looking like herself, composed and careful. The version of my mother that I know best, the one that processes difficulty by managing the presentation of it. We ordered. We made small talk through it in the way that people make small talk when they are waiting for the other thing to begin. Then she said, "I said what I said because I was frightened." She said it looking at the table rather than at me, which told me it had cost her something to say. I was frightened that she had spent her last years alone and that I had not been there enough, and it was easier to make it about you than to sit with that. I looked at my mother for a long time. I thought about the letter. I thought about what Evelyn had written. I love all of you. I mean it without reservation. I thought about the blue cup on the second shelf, and the Sunday afternoons and the 6 years of driving 40 minutes each way because I wanted to, not because I was afraid of what not going would cost me. I said, she was not alone. She said, I know that now. She looked up finally. She said, I think I knew it then too. I just did not want to know it the way I would have had to act on it. I do not know what to do with that sentence except to hold it carefully, the way you hold something that is true and painful, and that you did not ask for. My mother loved Evelyn. She did not show up on Sundays, but she loved her. Those two things can coexist, and I'm not the one who gets to weigh them against each other. That is between my mother and whatever she does with the years she has left. I moved into the house on Palmetto Street 3 months after the memorial. The house has a particular quality in the mornings that I did not fully understand when I was a visitor. The light comes through the kitchen window from the east, and in the summer it arrives early and stays clean for about 2 hours before it shifts, and those 2 hours are the best part of the day. Evelyn was always in the kitchen in those early hours. I had always arrived at 10 or 11, after the best light had moved on, and so I had never seen it until I lived there. I think about that. The things you do not see until you're actually there. Some things about a person and a place only become visible if you commit to the whole of it rather than the arranged portions. You show up at your own convenience and you see what your convenience allows. You show up every Sunday for 6 years and you see something else entirely. Gloria came by 3 weeks after I moved in, not for any official reason, just to see how things were settling. She brought a plant, something small and hardy. We had tea in the kitchen, and we talked about Evelyn for about an hour in the easy way of people who knew her well enough to remember specific things rather than general impressions. Then Gloria told me something I had not known. She said that on the mornings she came for work, the 3 mornings a week in the last year, Evelyn would sometimes already be at the kitchen table when she arrived, the crossword open, a second cup of tea set out and cooling. Not for Gloria. For me. She would forget, in those early morning hours, that Sunday was not every day, and she would set out the second cup, the blue cup, the way she always did when I was coming, and then remember, and put it back on the shelf. Gloria had seen it happen more than once, and had never said anything because there was nothing useful to say. I sat with that for a long time after Gloria left. Evelyn at the kitchen table in the early light, the crossword open, the second cup cooling on the table, the small forgetting, and then the remembering. I'm not going to try to tell you what that image does to me because I do not have language adequate to it. What I will say is that it is the thing I think about when I need to remember why the Sundays mattered. Not the inheritance, not the letter. That cup, set out and then put back, on mornings I was not there. The blue cup is on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet now. I use it every Sunday. I make the tea the same way she made it. I sit at the kitchen table in the same chair I always sat in, and I drink it slowly, and sometimes I do the crossword, and sometimes I just sit with the morning and the light and the quiet, and the particular feeling of being somewhere you're exactly meant to be. Last Sunday, I finished a Friday crossword in 41 minutes, which is a personal record. I wrote the time in the margin the way Evelyn would have, a small notation for no one, and I put it on the pile she kept on the left side of the desk, the pile she would go through at the end of each month to see how her times had trended. I have inherited the habit along with the desk and the pile and the cup on the second shelf. The letter is in the top drawer. Cream envelope. Evelyn's handwriting on the front. For my family to be read by Claire. I have read it many times since the memorial, not because I need to be reminded of what it says, but because her handwriting is in it, and reading it is one of the ways I still talk to her, which I know sounds like a strange thing to say, and which I would not trade for anything. She told me I would know when to read it. She was right. She was right about most things, which is one of the reasons I still talk to her on Sunday mornings at the kitchen table, and always will. If someone has been quietly dismissing the way you love people, telling you that your showing up is a strategy, that your presence is a form of taking, hear this. Evelyn said it better than I ever could. There is a difference between arriving when there's something to take and arriving when there's nothing to take except an afternoon and a cup of tea. The people who love you know the difference, they always have, and some of them will find a way to say so, in their own words, in a letter they leave in a cream envelope for you to read out loud when the room finally needs to hear it. There is something I want to say about the years between my grandfather's death and Evelyn's, because those years are the ones that tend to get compressed in a story like this one, and they deserve more than compression. They were 7 years. 7 years of a woman learning to live alone in a house that had been built for two, and of me learning what it means to be the person someone relies on, not because they asked you to be, but because you decided to be and then kept deciding, Sunday after Sunday, without announcing the decision or expecting it to be acknowledged. In year 1, she was still in the shock of it. The specific shock of a long marriage ending in the ordinary way. A Thursday morning in the hospital, my grandfather's hand going still in hers, she did not fall apart, which I had half expected, which was naive of me because Evelyn had never been a person who fell apart in visible ways. She came home from the hospital and she made tea, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she looked out the window for a long time, and then she said, "I suppose I will need to learn how to manage the car insurance." That was the first practical thing she said after he died. Car insurance, I found it the most heartbreaking and the most Evelyn thing she could have said. In year 2, she learned to sleep through the night again, which she mentioned to me once without elaborating, the way she mentioned things she considered private while still considering them worth naming. She said, "I can sleep again." I said, "Good." She said, "It took longer than I expected." I said, "These things do?" She nodded and moved on to the crossword, and we never discussed it again. But I thought about it for weeks afterward, the image of her alone in the house that had been built for two, learning to sleep. In year 3, she started the garden in earnest. Tomatoes and herbs along the south fence, peonies along the front walk that she had been meaning to plant for 20 years, and had finally gotten to. She sent me home with tomatoes every Sunday from July through October that year and asked detailed questions about how I was using them, which was her way of being interested in my life without asking directly about things she thought I would tell her when I was ready to tell her. In years 4 and 5 she was, I think, most fully herself. Settled into the shape of her life without him, which was a different shape but not a lesser one, and present in a way that the first years of grief do not always allow. She was funnier in those years than I had ever known her to be, dry, precise, the humor of a person who has decided that the time for decorum has passed and the time for saying exactly what she thinks has arrived. She told me once, without preamble, that she had never liked the decorative plate collection my Aunt Pat had given her as a wedding gift, and had always kept it on the high shelf in the spare room because it was easier than explaining. She had kept that plate collection on that shelf for 40 years. I laughed for about a minute. She was pleased with herself. In years 6 and 7, the body began its accounting. Slowly at first, then with more insistence. The mobility first, the stairs becoming a negotiation rather than an automatic thing. Then the driving, which I have already told you about. She managed these losses with the same matter-of-fact composure she brought to everything, naming them directly without dwelling in them, adapting without requiring anyone to make a ceremony of the adaptation. I drove her to her appointments and she thanked me with the specific precision of a person who knows the difference between a genuine thank you and a performative one. She never said you really did not have to. She knew I had chosen to. She thanked me for the choice. What I'm trying to tell you is that those 7 years were not a sacrifice. I know that is what some people will assume because that is what the story sounds like from the outside. The successful granddaughter giving up her Sundays for the elderly widow, and I understand why it reads that way. But it was not that. It was the best ongoing conversation of my adult life with the person I understood best, and who understood me best, and the fact that it also required driving 40 minutes each way, and learning which pharmacist she preferred, and sometimes sitting in hospital chairs does not change what it fundamentally was. It was where I most wanted to be on Sunday afternoons. It is still where I most want to be. In some sense that has not resolved itself with her being gone, which is why I'm still at that kitchen table on Sundays making the tea the way she made it. I have been in the house on Palmetto Street for 8 months now. The neighborhood is beginning to know me, which happens slowly in Charleston in the way it happens slowly in places where people have lived for a long time and are careful about who they extend themselves toward. Evelyn's neighbor Margaret, who is 76 and has been on Palmetto Street for 40 years, brought me a casserole in my first week and has since adopted a posture of benevolent surveillance that I find entirely comforting. She knew Evelyn well. She has told me things I did not know, small things. The way Evelyn tended the front garden in the early morning before the heat arrived. The particular chair she preferred on the porch on autumn evenings. The way she talked about me to Margaret over the fence on Sunday afternoons after I had gone. Margaret said, "She used to tell me you were the one who asked good questions. She said it was the rarest thing in a young person." I said, "She asked good questions too." Margaret said, "I know. She taught you." I thought about that for a while afterward. The things we absorb without knowing we are absorbing them, carried forward in ways we do not recognize until someone names them from the outside. The savings are in an account I have been thoughtful about, in the way Evelyn was thoughtful about money, which is to say slowly and without urgency and with an awareness that the most important financial decisions are the ones made without pressure. A portion has gone into the house, which needed a new roof and work in the basement that had been deferred too long. A portion I have not touched and do not intend to touch for a long time. A portion I have used to give myself something that I think Evelyn intended, which is time. Time in the sense of reduced hours at the firm for the months after her death. Time in the sense of Sunday mornings that do not have to end by a certain hour, because something is pressing against the edges of the day. Evelyn was careful with money for 60 years, so that she could give someone she loved the gift of not having to rush, and I'm trying to use that gift in a way that honors what it was for. My mother and I have spoken carefully and at measured intervals since the restaurant conversation in Colombia. We have not resolved anything, which I think is the honest description of where we are. What we have is a ceasefire that neither of us has declared out loud, a willingness to be in the same room at Christmas and to speak about things other than the things that would require us to be in a different kind of conversation. I have started driving up to see her once a month, which is more than I was doing before. The conversations are careful, but I'm there, I'm making the drive. I'm sitting at her kitchen table and asking questions that are more than surface level and waiting to see which ones she is ready to answer. I do not know if it will become what the Sundays with Evelyn were. I think it probably will not, at least not in the same form. What I know is that the showing up is not contingent on the certainty of return. Evelyn taught me that without ever saying it directly. You show up because it is the right thing. Because the alternative is the slow drift she described on that November afternoon, the accumulation of distance until the depths are no longer accessible. You show up because some things are only visible if you're actually there. And if you're not there, you will not see them and you will not know what you missed. The crossword this morning was a Friday. I finished it in 41 minutes, which is a personal record. I wrote the time in the margin the way she would have, a small notation for no one, and put it on the pile on the left side of the desk. Her pile, my pile now. The habit hers, inherited along with the desk and the kitchen and the cup on the second shelf. I still talk to her on Sunday mornings at the kitchen table, in the chair that has always been mine, with the tea she taught me to make. I tell her about the week. I tell her about the crossword times, and the cases I am working on and the things Margaret said over the fence, and what the morning light looked like on Tuesday when it came through the window at exactly the right angle and stayed there longer than usual. I tell her the things I would have told her on any Sunday, because the Sundays have not stopped. They have just changed shape. She told me I would know when to read the letter. She was right. She was right about most things, which is one of the reasons I'm still talking to her, and always will be. In the kitchen she left me, with the cup she made sure I would have, on the mornings that are mine now because she decided they should be. If someone in your life has been watching you show up and seeing it clearly, trust that. If someone has been telling you that your love is a strategy, that your presence is suspect, that the person who accepted your Sundays was not of sound mind enough to know what they were receiving, hear this. Evelyn had 84 years to learn the difference between someone arriving when there is something to take and someone arriving when there is nothing to take except an afternoon and a cup of tea. She knew the difference. She wrote it down, and when the room needed to hear it, the words were already there in her handwriting, waiting. Drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one. Share this with someone who has been showing up for years without being thanked. Hit subscribe and I will see you in the next one.